in New York, in Richard Shrobe's office. Thank you for making time. So I think you know the project is about gathering sort of stories or histories of Zen Master Seung Sahn when he came to the US and sort of the beginnings of the school. So if people have just been basically telling me their stories about how they met him, how they got involved. If you can just start out that way.
Yeah. I met Seung Sahn in 1975. I was visiting some friends of mine who lived in upstate Connecticut and who I had been friendly with when I was involved with Swami Satchidananda and the Integral Yoga Institute, which was a period from about 1967 through 73, something like that. Anyway, it was summertime, and in those days we didn't have too much money, and so our vacation was to go visit friends of ours.
People with couches?
Who lived in the country. So we went to upstate Connecticut to visit this couple, and they told me that they had met a Korean Zen master who had a center in Providence and one in Cambridge, and that he was leading a retreat that weekend. And was I interested in going with them? They wanted to go. So I said, yeah, okay, I'll go. But I'll only stay one day because at that time my wife didn't know how to drive, and so I didn't want to leave her there with our three kids for too long. Although there were plenty of people around there that we knew. Anyway, so I went with them, and Seung Sahn gave a talk.
This was in Providence, or?
No, it was in Cambridge.
Okay.
But not where the current Cambridge Zen Center is. I don't know where that place was. Maybe Mark Houghton.
A previous incarnation of the Cambridge Zen Center.
Maybe two incarnations back.
Okay.
It was a large house, so a lot of people living there. Anyway, Seung Sahn gave a talk the night before the retreat was to begin. And two things made an impression on me. He kept saying, "Don't know," and his energy, made an impression on me. So the next morning, we got up to start the retreat, and they started with 108 prostrations, which I knew nothing about. I knew about sitting meditation, doing yoga postures, yoga breathing exercises.
But none of this
right.
kinesthetic aerobic thing.
Right, and at that time I was at least 40 pounds overweight, heavier than I am now. So they started doing these prostrations. And,
did they explain to you beforehand what was going to happen? Or?
Yeah,
oh, okay.
Mostly, but I didn't know what they were talking about. I realized, okay, yeah, no problem. I'll try anything. So probably when we got to about 20, I wasn't counting. I thought, wow, we must have done a lot already. And after maybe about 30 or 40, I just thought to myself, I'm either going to die here this morning of a heart attack or finish these, which I did. And so then they started interviews, and so I went up and bowed to Seung Sahn, and I told him that I had been a student of Swami Satchidananda. He knew Swami Satchidananda, but that I had gradually gotten somewhat more aligned with the Buddhist way of practicing than how they were practicing.
Right.
So he started with his usual format, which was to have you read the Human Root poem, and then give a little spiel after that that explained various things connected with the poem, and then he put his Zen stick down in front of me he said, so when you have complete donor mind, are you and this stick the same or different? And I said to him, well, Seung Sahn, that's just my problem. I said, because I've had some wonderful experiences in meditation, because I've been practicing like close to 10 years by then. I said, I've had some wonderful experiences in meditation, but I always feel a little separate from the world. And of course, yoga meditation emphasizes a certain kind of indrawnness, which was why I was gradually getting disenchanted with it, because I was indrawn enough, without that. So anyway, so I said, that's just my problem. I always feel a little separate from it. So he said, you ask me. So I said, you and the Zen stick the same, different? And he just hit the floor. Well, I thought that was both so absurd and so sharp at the same time that I just burst out laughing to the point of hysterics, and I kind of fell on the floor. And when I regained my composure, he continued with the interview, which was his standard first interview. But I had some very strong experience in this kind of just having him hit the floor and it kind of shocking me, so I sat the rest of the day, and I decided I would stay overnight and have one more interview with him, and then leave and go back to Connecticut the next morning, which I did. And in the second interview, he told me that he had a center here in New York, and that if I wanted to go and practice with them, I could and I should. So when I got back to New York, I looked them up, and at that time the Zen Center was together with a Korean group. We were on Park Avenue South in the 20s somewhere, maybe 22nd Street.
This was in 1975?
1975.
So there was already a Zen Center in New York?
Yeah. They were just kind of, they hadn't really totally finished the construction of this place, because it was a loft space in a building, but it was done enough so that they could practice there, and the Koreans could have their Sunday morning practice.
So it was a combination of sort of his students and the Korean Sangha together.
Right. And there was a Korean monk living there at the time too, that he had brought from Korea, because these Korean students who were practicing there they weren't his students in the way we would say, that we were his students, but they were drawn to him. So he established this place, and then he brought a Korean monk here to run their side of the operation. So when I got there were two American students living there. Link Rhodes was one of them.
Oh, he was living in New York at the time.
At that time. He had come down from Providence to help get this place running.
Got it.
In fact, the two of them had both been at Providence Zen Center. The other guy's name was Jerry Schreier, and he moved away from practicing with us many years ago. But anyway.
So it was residential. They lived there at the time.
They lived there, and the Korean monk lived there.
Okay.
There wasn't a lot of space for people to live, but there were a few rooms. And when Consignee would come, then one of them would give up their room to him, and sleep in the Dharma.
Yeah.
So anyway, I came for evening practice one night, and afterwards they invited me to stay for tea. And I think it was just the three of us. At least it was just the three of us having tea together. So I explained to them, that I had been involved with the Temporal Yoga Institute, that I had been the head of yoga teacher training at Temporal Yoga Institute, and that I had left there. And I told them, Link Rhodes always loves to tell us. Whenever he comes to New York to lead a retreat,
He tells the story?
He tells the story.
Okay.
So I told the two of them, I said, I'm going to come over here and practice with you, but I am not going to assume any responsibility in the organization.
Famous last words.
Right. So
Why did you say that at the time?
because I had assumed a lot of responsibility in the Integral Yoga organization, and in a sense, it gave me a subtle feeling of being somebody. You know, and I recognized one time, shortly before I met Seung Sahn, I went to hear a talk of Trungpa Rinpoche's, and at that time, Swami Satchidananda used to give large public talks at a church over on, I forget, somewhere on the west side, in the 70s. Anyway, and large crowds would come, and because I was the head of teacher training and teaching classes there, a lot of these people knew me. So whenever I would come into, the store, I would feel like, oh, I'm one of the in crowd, I mean, it wasn't a huge, I didn't have a huge big head about it, but subtly, and so, anyway, when I went to this talk of Trungpa's, it was also in some church, and I walked in, and I had a momentary recognition. No one here knows who I am. And suddenly that felt refreshing. So that's why I told them, I am not assuming any responsibility here.
Good idea.
Yeah, right.
Didn't work so good.
So
they let you come back even though you didn't want to become involved.
Right. So at that time, the Seung Sahn used to come once a month when he was on the East Coast, and he would lead a 3-day yoga junjun. He'd start on a Thursday night and end Sunday morning, mid-morning, because then the Korean Sangha would come back up there, kind of the same way that it...
Like in Miami, yeah.
So, in those years, I got to have quite a few interviews with him because he was coming once a month and, etc. So
why did you actually, I mean, you said you were a little disenchanted or growing out of the yoga stuff that you'd been doing for 10 years. So apart from the sort of first impression of his energy or something there being appealing, what about the practice or about his teaching?
I mean, honestly, I wasn't hunting for a teacher at that time, because I had been through a very intense relationship with Swami Satchidananda, and in the yoga tradition, the guru gets kind of elevated and etc. But I had already been reading a number of books from a Buddhist perspective, Zen books, and Tibetan books, so I was already kind of introduced to that kind of practice, kind of present-centered awareness, mindfulness practice, either going in or out, all that kind of thing, which was somewhat different than the way I had been practicing when I was Swami Satchidananda's student. It wasn't totally different, but there were certain aspects of it that felt more down to earth and more in the world kind of, which I recognized that I needed.
I guess he had been.
So it wasn't that I was so enamored of Seung Sahn.
Right.
I liked him, and I could see he had something, and that I could study with him. But it wasn't like, it wasn't like that.
How were his teachings at the time? Was his English pretty good, pretty bad, somewhere on the way, or?
Well, depends.
I mean, I know he started out with like nothing, right? And so, I mean, but he must have eventually picked up.
By the time I came, must have been right around the time that Dropping Ashes on the Buddha came out.
Okay.
And so he had been teaching at least at Providence Zen Center and maybe Cambridge and New Haven for a couple of years already. He came to Providence in 1972, I think.
Yeah.
So his English was very limited. His accent was very thick. But if you listened for a while and got used to his patterns of speech, then you could begin to understand what he was saying most of the time. And especially if you got used to his patterns of speech and realized that he was using very simple English to express things that weren't necessarily so simple, you know, that was refreshing.
The Korean Sangha had a monk there who was leading their practice. Was the Seung Sahn also teaching them?
Yeah, when he would come to New York and lead Youngman Junjin with us, then when we would end Youngman Junjin mid-morning on Sunday, he would then participate in the Korean service and maybe give a Dharma speech in Korean to them, you know, hang out with them, and also many times he wouldn't sit the whole retreat all day long with us. He would give interviews in the morning, and then most days he would go out somewhere. Usually some Korean lay people would come and pick him up, you know. So I don't know exactly what he was doing. I don't know, maybe the Sangha building and stuff like that. And then he would frequently come back and sit with us in the evening. And sometimes some Korean lay people would come and sit in the evening with us also.
So there was a little bit of crossover, but it was pretty much two separate groups.
Yes, although there were a few people in that group who were reasonably serious Zen practitioners as well.
In the Korean group?
Yes, and they continued to practice. One of them, both the father and the mother, they're the parents of Black and her name. She's a member of the Open Meadow.
Oh yeah. I know what you mean.
Yeah. She's a psychologist. She was on
I have an interview actually taken with her mother.
Her mother was there too.
Yes.
Yeah. Her mother was a serious practitioner at that time, and the husband even more so. The husband had known Seung Sahn in Korea, Mr. Lee.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was part of that group from the beginning. They would come and sit, and sometimes they would sit most of the retreat with us. But a lot of times, like on a Saturday evening, a whole throng of lay Korean people would show up around dinner time, and they would bring a lot of Korean food. So the food got decidedly better for Saturday dinner than it had been for Friday, you know. And Seung Sahn was usually there at that time too, you know. And then he would sit in the evening, but he would only give one interview a day each morning.
Do you think that, I mean, you might know that the practice in the Korean Sangha, was it different from the practice that he was sort of introducing or that you were doing in our group?
I think, although I never stayed to practice with them, but I have at other times in later years seen what goes on, and it was mostly, you know, chanting, maybe chanting Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, and chanting Consignee and the homage to the Three Jewels and the Heart Sutra in Korean. I think that was pretty much it, and then maybe some talk, and then they'd have a meal together. I don't think that if they would sit meditation at all, it would be very short.
So why did the Seung Sahn teach the Americans all this sitting meditation thing? Since that's not really that prevalent, I guess, in the Korean tradition that he was also.
No, but it's prevalent in the Korean monastic tradition. And when he came here, he saw that there were these lay people that were interested in participating in that, because there were already some Japanese groups here, and so he saw that, and he did the same thing, similar thing.
How do you think he changed the Korean practice that he came from to fit the American context? I mean, part of it you already mentioned, that there was a focus on lay people practicing meditation through the Japanese teachers who had been here. Other things you think?
Yeah. If you go to a Korean temple in Korea, and sit in the Zen hall there, they never chant like we do. If they chant at all, they come out of that hall and come down to the Buddha hall maybe before lunchtime to have, because in a Korean temple there's a rice offering that's done before the midday meal. So they might come down and participate in that. Sometimes they might not. But in general, when they get up in the morning, they put on the big kasa, and they do 3 prostrations, and then they start sitting and walking, sitting and walking, sitting and walking. And the first Zen Junction that I went to, they were still following the timing that's used in most Korean temples, which is sit 50 minutes and walk 10 minutes. Later we shortened it gradually, 40 minutes and then 30 minutes. But so in a Korean Zen hall, there wouldn't be chanting, there wouldn't be 108 prostrations. It would just be sitting, morning meal, work period, sitting again. If they were going to have chanting at all, they would come and join the other, or not at all, and that would be it, all day long, until late at night, as far as I know.
So he combined that with chanting and other things, so that made it for everybody.
Right. Right. And I think, because he also himself liked practicing chanting and got many of his experiences, I think, during chanting practice. So he saw the benefit of that as another kind of meditation, and had the idea that, no matter, not that this was his idea, it's there in the tradition, but he was emphasizing it, that no matter what you're doing, whether it's chanting or sitting or walking or eating or working, or that all that is meditation. All that is keeping one big question: who's participating in this? What is it? So he saw all those things as useful ways of, whereas in a strict Korean Zen monastery, they just emphasize this, keep this one big question, and practice with that for years and years and years until you have some huge breakthrough experience, or don't have something, But he was not emphasizing that huge breakthrough experience. He was emphasizing, whenever you drop discursive thinking and conceptual overlays, that at that moment, that's a moment of clear mind. And the more you cultivate that, the more you're engaged in enlightened activity. So that was his emphasis. And you don't see that emphasis so much in the Zen temples in Korea. They will say that sometimes, because it's there as part of the tradition. But what they emphasize is sit, one big question for years and years and years. Even the Konan style of practice that he, put forth, they don't typically do that in a Korean Zen temple. They only keep this one big question that.
How did you when you started practicing? How did you like the chanting? Since that's often like.
Yeah, but see, I had come from an Indian yoga thing where there was a lot of chanting,
So it wasn't weird or strange.
Oh, no, it wasn't weird at all. They're doing chanting here just like we did over there.
Okay.
It's a little less melodic than what we had over there, but.
And the bowing apparently you got used to as well.
Yeah, that we never had in the yoga.
That's interesting.
I'll tell you a funny story from that time.
Okay.
When we would have Youngmin Junjun, at that time, instead of following the form that we do now, where the head Dharma teacher walks with the stick, at that time, everybody would take a turn with the stick, and it went something like this. The head Dharma teacher would have the moktak on the floor in front of them, and the first person would come to the altar, take the stick from the altar, bow, etc., and go around maybe 2 times. And then, when they came in front of the next person, the head Dharma teacher would hit the moktak, and you bow to the person who was going to take it from you, and then they would stand up and switch and go on. So there was this continuous activity going on, sitting, It was quiet, but there was an activity going on. And I think that came from maybe in the Korean Zen halls, when they have what they call Youngmin Junjun, in the middle of the Kyolche, the 7 days without sleep, quote unquote, I believe they use something like that, keep everybody awake more. But anyway, so we followed that format at that time. So it was evening sitting practice, and Seung Sahn was there, and this Korean monk, who was the head of the Korean side, he would usually come in and do chanting of the 3 jewels with us and participate in that. And then he might sit one period, especially if Seung Sahn was there, he'd sit one period. If not, he might go back to his room, because he was basically a scholar and a calligrapher. He was here studying English at the New School. Anyway, and he would typically, if he was sitting, he would fall asleep. So the stick switched to some guy who was there for the first time, and you could see this guy was a little off. So
they gave him the stick on the first time sitting.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I mean, it had all been explained at the beginning, but in any case, he's walking around. Now, typically, a lay person would never hit a monk, in regular Korean. I mean, in our school, we don't make that distinction. So, but this guy is walking around. He knew anyone who he saw sleeping, he was supposed to hit them, or tap them on the shoulder, and then they were supposed to, So he came in front of Consignee, the Korean monk, and Consignee was, and he raised up the stick, and Seung Sahn jumped up, he took the stick from him, and the whole room broke up.
Laughing? I assume. Sanim woke up, I assume.
Yeah. I think we had a 10-minute intermission before we went back to sleep. I just remember that.
Wow. So did you live at the Zen Center too at that point? Or no, you were just coming to practice? How big was the community in New York? I mean, the Zen Center practitioners?
There were maybe 10 to 15 people who were members, but most days and nights of the week, only a couple of people would show up. And then when we have Young and Gender, more people would come, and people would come from other centers as well.
So there was more of a exchange and traveling around in the Northeast here.
Right.
Because it's closer.
In fact, I remember when Consignee used to come. He was a layperson at that time. I don't know if he was still studying at Yale or whether he graduated, but I remember him coming a few times.
So, did you start taking on responsibility?
Yeah. First thing that happened was, after a few months, Consignee said, it was myself and a couple of other people who had come from some Japanese group. So we had been practicing for a while, in one form or another. So he said to the three of us, taking 5 precepts is necessary. So, okay. It didn't make any difference to me,
So it didn't make any difference to you, it wasn't important, it was just something, he thinks that's important, so you do it?
Yes, he thinks it's important, okay, I'll take the 5 precepts, I had already been exposed to similar teachings, through the Yoga Sutras. They have what they call yama and niyama, five do's and the 5 don'ts, or something, so it wasn't like foreign. So okay, you want to have this ceremony and do this form? Yeah, okay. Because I knew that there was both a formality to it, and yet that in the Zen teaching, none of these forms was legally binding. Forms.
Were you wearing robes and stuff at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
same as now.
Yeah, and they had guest robes there, and I think probably Link and Jerry Schwer were already Dharma teachers, so they had known those. So anyway, we had Yongmen Junjin 1 month, and Saturday night, right after chanting, instead of starting sitting immediately, Consignee led a 5 precept ceremony for the 3 of us. So that was how I took the 5 precepts. And it was interesting, at that time also, I still worked as a musician part-time, as well as a social worker during the day. So many times I would have a gig on a Saturday night, and I would sit in retreat all day, and then leave whenever I had to leave in the evening to go to work. And then I would come back about 2 or 3 in the morning after the gig was over, and get about an hour's sleep. And then get up for Sunday morning practice, because Consignee was giving interviews again on Sunday morning. So anyway, that was how I took the 5 precepts. And about a year later, we didn't have any kind of formal Dharma teacher and training thing at that time. So about a year later, he said, 10 precepts and then to become Dharma teacher.
So it was 10 precepts was the same as Dharma teacher at the time. Yeah. And so again, I said, okay. It wasn't like I was going anywhere, or that I had doubts about not practicing there with them. So, okay, if this is part of the, I'll do that. So that precept ceremony we had in Providence, since Ken Kessel and I took the 10 precepts at the same time. Okay. He was practicing in New York at the time?
No, he was
up in Providence. Okay, yeah.
He came to New York somewhat later, I think mostly because his grandfather was living in New York and wasn't so well anymore, and he wanted to have a family member, so he came down here.
Interesting. So the you stuck with this, it sounds like, because the practice worked for you.
Yeah.
Not so much a super strong identification with the Consignee, but
right.
How important were his teachings to you?
Very important.
Okay.
And his way of presenting a fairly comprehensive Buddhist teaching within very limited Zen vocabulary was meaningful.
Did you get that mostly from the once a month visits, or was there a lot of letter writing? Or
I didn't do a lot of letter writing to him on occasion, but at that time, instead of at the end of practice in the evening or in the morning, instead of what most Zen centers seem to do now is read from the 365 Konan book. But at that time, there were already many of his teaching letters collected, and every Zen center had a copy of them. And so we would read one of these teaching letters at the end of practice. So I got to see his style of teaching through these teaching letters, as well as my personal interactions with him, and
Yeah, that's sort of a daily teaching.
In fact, it's too bad from my perspective that we don't go back to using those teaching letters, because there's a lot of rich stuff in them. But it took a little longer to read them than it takes to read most of them.
So what happened then? I mean, this is still a small group of 2 people in a little Zen center, and
yeah. Well, what happened next was the Korean Sangha and the American Sangha split. And I don't remember what the reasons were, whether there was some discord, or whether the Korean monk wanted to have his own thing, but they moved from that place to someplace over in the West Village, and we had no particular place to go to. But there was a Korean woman who was practicing with us. She was a dancer. Traditional Korean dance and modern dance, and she had a fairly large loft on, I think it was 17th Street, right off of Union Square, which was not very far from where we were at that time. And she said, the Zen Center can move to my loft because I'm not teaching dance classes in the evening there, and we can have practice there. Practice early in the morning there as well. And by that time, also Link Rhodes had left and gone to the West Coast to live in the Zen Center in Los Angeles. And Jerry Schreier, because the Zen Center was now moving, he tried living in Sun Ok Lee's dance studio place. She had a room, but he didn't like it too much, so he got an apartment in the East Village. And what happened was we volunteered to cover practice. Well, maybe we didn't volunteer, but anyway, Jerry was initially living there, so he was covering the morning practice, which usually would be just him, or maybe I would come sometimes, or somebody else would come, but then he moved out of there, and he was living maybe 20 minutes away, 20-minute walk away. I was also living about 15-minute walk away. And just around that time, Seung Sahn came to New York to maybe lead Young and Junjin, or see how things were going in this dance studio, etc. Anyway, we had a meeting with him, and we said, Seung Sahn, we would like to eliminate morning practice because no one was coming, and it's really difficult to get here at 5 in the morning or whatever time it was. And, so we'd like to. So he said, yeah, well, you could do that, but then you would be a Zen club.
A Zen club. This was not a good term, was it?
And he said it with just enough disdain, subtly, on the edges of his mouth, that you could tell he did not like that idea. And he went on a little further. You could be a Zen club, and because his idea was, if you're a Zen center, practice goes on morning and evening, 7 days a week. You know, we're not as strict about that these days as he was at that time, but you know, so we have some Zen centers that maybe have to do like in Florida. They don't have practice there every morning and every evening. But,
in Orlando we do, but yeah.
Yeah. But in any case, we've modified that over the years. You know, as long as there's a certain sincerity practice in the place. But anyway, at that time he was emphatic with that. So you could be a Zen club. Maybe I would come here. Maybe I would come here sometimes to lead young men judging. So we all looked at each other around the table and realized, okay, we better do something. So we said, yeah, okay, we can continue with morning practice, and what we'll do is each one of us will volunteer to take a different morning cover. And so he said, yeah, you try that. He said, try for 10,000 years nonstop. That was the first time I ever heard him use that phrase.
Oh, okay.
So in the midst of this tension-filled situation, it had a deep impact. You know? So that's what happened there for a while, and we practiced there probably for a year or so, and at that time a group of Korean doctors started coming, and this Mr. Lee that I mentioned before, he was still coming and participating when Consignee was there. But this group of Korean doctors started coming. Some of them were psychiatrists, one of them was a cardiologist, and they were pretty serious, at least at that time, in terms of practicing with us. I remember the first time this cardiologist showed up. He was the first one, and he came in the middle of Yongman Junjin, and we were all sleeping overnight there, all in the Dharma room. So I said to him, Dr. Khan, would you like me to get a blanket? No, I'll just throw my overcoat over me.
So they were they Koreans from Korea who had come here, so
yes.
they were familiar with Chogya practice?
I guess so, I don't know, or they heard about him and were kind of interested in his teaching, especially as related to psychology and stuff like that. You know, some of them were psychiatrists, you know, so anyway, so after some months of practicing in her dance studio, that wasn't working anymore for whatever reasons. And so one of our members, American woman, Carol Korsanovsky, she had a small railroad apartment on East 6th Street in the East Village. It was right over a famous ale house, McSorley's Ale House. And she said, we can practice in the evenings in my apartment. Can't have morning practice there. But we can practice every evening in my apartment. And you know, I have this living room / dining room, you know, area, you know, think her bed was in the kitchen area, like a loft kind of style bed. So we began to have practice there, and around that time, Seung Sahn gave Inca to George Bowman and Bobby Rhodes, and so sometimes they would come down and lead Young Men Judging. When we would, when one of them would come, we would have Young Men Judging in this woman's apartment. And the toilet was right in the kitchen area somewhere, you know. So, and there was no interview room, so George or Bobby would give interviews in the kitchen. And so while interviews were going on, you couldn't use the toilet, you know. But in any case, and when Seung Sahn would come, we had one member who, he was one of the guys who took 5 precepts with me. He had studied with some Japanese teacher before, and he was a lawyer and had a fairly large house out in Long Beach on Long Island. And so whenever Seung Sahn would come, he would let us use his house. And at first, we had Young Men Judging in the living room, dining room area, and his wife and children had to put up with us. I don't know what they did. But later, we used the basement area, which was finished, you know, to have Young Men Judgings down there.
And that was more spacious and more convenient for retreat.
Yeah, because when George or Bobby would come, not so many people would show up. But when Seung Sahn was coming, many Americans would show up, a few Koreans. This group of Korean doctors would come at that time. People from other Zen centers sometimes. So we needed a larger space. So it was during that period, which maybe lasted a year, 2 years, I don't know, that Seung Sahn got a number of people who had some resources. Seung Sahn was one. Diana Lynch, who, you know her?
Yeah.
She was another one. And this group of Korean doctors and this Sun Bae Lee, they all put up some money, and I guess it was enough for the down payment. We bought a building on 32nd Street. I think it was a 6-story building that had like a restaurant down on the first floor, luncheonette style restaurant. So we moved there. And then we had a residential center again. And we were also together with a Korean group, because there were remnants of this Korean group that had split off from us, who still wanted to be associated with the Seung Sahn. And so they came back, and so we had the same kind of situation again, where he got some Korean monk or nun to come and run the place.
And they would live there too, in the same building.
And for a while, we had, I don't know, half a dozen to a dozen people living there, etc. Some strange things happened during that period.
Some strange things happened. That sounds like there are some stories to be told. What kind of strange things?
Well, it's hard for me to remember all of this, but someone came from Providence to be the director, the residential director, a guy named Will Love. And he was not highly experienced in running a building and all these kind of things. Anyway, it was decided that we would rent out some of the floors in this building because we didn't have so many people living there, so we weren't using all the floors for the Zen Center. So we decided we would rent out for income to help with the mortgage on some of the floors. And so Will was in charge of getting people to come and move in. Somebody moved his estranged wife and children in there, and he was a slickster and understood the real estate situation because the zoning of this building was, I don't know, there were some questions about whether residential people could live there.
Oh, okay.
You know, there was something was not exactly according to Hoyle. But I mean, that was going on all over New York, you know, so it was nothing, it wasn't like the Zen Center was doing something horrendously illegal. But this guy understood the ins and outs of that stuff, and he parked his family there, and he didn't pay rent for months and months and months, you know. And so eventually it wound up in some kind of court case, and it was a very uncolorful situation. You know. Some mistakes were made in handling it, you know.
On the part of people in the Zen Center?
Yes,
or Zen
yes,
Center?
yeah.
Probably not a lot of experience with that sort of situation, right?
Right.
And people who were probably fairly young.
Yes, yeah. And also, Seung Sahn got involved at a certain point, and when he thought something was unfair, he could get pushy and push back, you know. So some stuff went on that, you know, it wasn't the best way of handling it. Let me not say anymore. And I don't remember all the details of it because I wasn't living in the Zen Center. You know,
So this is interesting. So when he thought something was unfair, he would get pushy, like unfair to the Zen Center, to people involved.
Yeah, if he felt something was unjust, he could, you know, get his own anger up about it, you know, a kind of righteous indignation. But his way of sometimes handling it would be, you know, like some crazy Zen action, you know.
Yeah. The one of the really interesting things that I've sort of heard people talk about is, or what I always thought was interesting, here's this Korean Zen master, right, coming in the 70s to all these American hippies. And, I mean, coming from this really Confucian, patriarchal culture, how did that, I mean, he couldn't have shown up here with this.
But he wasn't very bound by that. You know, he was, look, if you look at the immediate lineage that he comes from, there were some wild men there. You know, Kyung-ho-sung was a wild man, you know. Mangong-sung maybe a little more moderate, you know, but you know, and Kobong-sung, you know, was you know, these were like, you know, so so in certain ways, you know, he was not bound by a kind of, you know, kind of formality. Although he when I asked him about that one time, he said something like, if a Zen master is living in a temple, then he should adhere to the formality of what temple life is like. You know, so Mangong-sung, for example, lived at Sudoksa for a long time, and that's a rather large temple. You know, an old temple. You know, it has historic significance in the Korean tradition. So I think he was more. His decorum was more moderate for the most part, whereas Kyung-ho-sung traveled here and there, you know, and was more a freedom-style monk. You know, how he was when he would be a guest teacher in some temple, I don't know, you know, but he certainly was more free, and you know, many of the stories about him indicate a certain kind of you know, crazy wisdom style freedom action. same with Consignee. So in any case, he was not so bound by the strictness of that, but he also, was not going to just trash it, and one of the things about Seung Sahn, I don't know whether he ever had an issue with alcohol himself. Maybe when he was in the army, I don't know exactly, but he would never break that rule. I never saw him take a drink anywhere.
Oh, so he would never drink?
Never. So, even someone told me he used to go to Gethsemane to teach the monks there, Zen style. I guess they'd have a short retreat and stuff. And even for the communion, he would not drink the wine.
Must have had a reason, yeah.
So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But in any case, he was pretty free to do what he felt was needed to, Bodhisattva path says join and then leave, essentially. So he knew how to join,
That is in some ways pretty incredible. I mean, the formality, what you're saying, that makes a lot of sense to me, but having been in Korea and some of the temples, it's pretty striking that the sort of gender difference, I mean, the separateness, right, that monks and nuns practice separately, and the kind of, higher regard for monks, and that, a nun would never be in charge of any monk.
Yeah.
And that, it doesn't seem that that's anything that he tried to impose here. I mean, the first Inca transmissions were Bobby and George, right? Well, George, Jacob, and Bobby, I guess. But
no, not Jacob. Jacob
came late. Oh, that's right, with you, right? Yeah. But I mean, so Bobby was among the first, and so there seemed to have not been a particular preference. I mean, how do you think he was able to not, or to leave that sort of baggage,
because
if he did?
I think his idea was that he would have a more inclusive community, men, women, monks, nuns, all practicing together.
That was pretty untypical, right?
Yeah.
For Koreans and teachers.
Yeah. The only place I've seen any hint of anything like that, in the 1200 AD period, Chinul, who was a great Zen master in Korea, had some kind of community, what was it called, Samadhi and Prajna community. And I think there they welcomed anyone who was serious about practice. I think so. Now, how homogenized it was or not, I don't know, but I do remember reading something like that.
Was your impression that he was equally invested in teaching lay people and also creating a monastic community? Because there were some early monastics in the Americas.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't see, the monastics were never in New York, so I didn't see how much he was invested in that or not. And he was pretty free in making, if someone wanted to be a monk, he was pretty free in, not following the tradition of how to make a monk at that time,
What does that mean? There wasn't any formal training in that sense, or?
Well, it was probably training, in the sense of hanging out with him, but and being part of the Zen Center. The monks in the early days, they were part of the Zen Center and had some job of responsibility in the Zen Center.
But they didn't go to Korea or have some other sort of monastic training.
They might have gone to Korea to sit a kyolche, because a few times that happened in the early days. But again, those kyolches that were there, I think, because lay people went too, and lay people would have never been accepted into a formal Zen. I think what he did was he found some temple in Korea that was willing to have us have a kyolche there.
Separately or together with the existing monastic communities?
Or maybe that temple wasn't happening. You know, you have to remember that what you've seen in Korea in recent years has become very organized and very, you know. When I first went to Korea in 1987, it was not as it is today.
How so?
It was more raggedy. You know, and there were less people that were really serious about practicing, whether they were monks and nuns or not. I mean, there were some. I don't mean to say there was, you know, but so there could have been some temple that had no formal kyolche going on in it. So the first time I think that he sent some people to do a kyolche, they went to Sudoksa, and they were sitting in one of the halls there. But I think Sudoksa at that time didn't have their own kyolche, or they had a kyolche in the small temple way up on top of the mountain, Junkeisa. And I know that later, when we had our kyolches at another temple, what was the name of that temple?
In Korea?
Yeah. Seung Sahn had a friend, another monk. He had a reputation as being a expert on the precepts, you know, the Vinaya, Vinaya. Byakamsani was his name. I don't remember that name, but in any case, we used his temple for quite a few years to have kyolches there, and he had stopped having Korean kyolches there because the story I got was, you know, in Korea for the kyolche, it's not just the monks that you have in your own temple. They travel all around and, you know, have to apply for it. But anyway, he had enough lunatics come there that he didn't want to be bothered with it anymore. So Seung Sahn asked him, could we have a kyolche there? And so he said, okay, you know, because he trusted Seung Sahn. So for many years, Decorum or somebody else would lead the kyolche in this temple.
Would the folks come from? Would Americans just go over there then, or were there people coming from the? From all the different Zen centers. Was this before the monastery was built?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Once they built Sudoksa, not Sudoksa, Musansa.
Okay.
Then we stopped having it at this small temple.
So, but when you went to, when was the first time you went to Korea?
In '87.
Was that in the context of a kyolche or?
No, it was in the context of a Whole World's a Single Flower conference, which we had at Sudoksa, and then we went on a bus tour of all the temples in Korea, many temples. Same kind of thing.
So tell me a little bit more about your sort of career in the Zen school. When was the formally quantum school sort of
at that time, at the period that I'm talking about, we were not yet quantum school of Zen, or quantum Zen school, or whatever we call it.
Right.
It was a kind of loose confederation of Zen centers that were all his Zen centers. And I don't remember exactly when that, but it must have happened somewhere in the early 80s, would be my guess.
Why do you think the school came to be?
I think it was in need of some central organization. And by then also we had centers in Europe as well. And so they came up with this idea of calling ourselves the Quantum School of Zen. And there was a central office at Providence Zen Center. At that time, Consignee was already the abbot of it, or somebody else first, and J.W. Harrington gradually became the director there after a few other people.
What do you think was the purpose of the school? I mean, apart from centralizing some organizational things.
To help Seung Sahn with his travel and itinerary, and to help various Zen centers that needed some support from a central organization, even just in terms of sending materials to them, and, all that kind of stuff.
So, the Seung Sahn was traveling sort of constantly during this time. It sounds like he was visiting all of these centers all the time.
Yeah. I mean, if he was in this country, he would be splitting his time between being on the East Coast and then being on the West Coast, because we had centers in Berkeley and in Los Angeles, and later in Seattle as well.
So you would stay in the Zen centers for a couple of weeks and then move on?
Sometimes, sometimes less. And then, of course, he started going to Europe as well. I mean, the European thing was interesting because the way that got started, the Polish one, which was the first one, when around the same time that I showed up at the Zen Center here in New York, I told them that I was not taking on any organizational responsibilities. There was a young Polish guy, I don't know whether he was here as an exchange student for a year or he had some internships on it. Anyway, he was from Krakow. Anthony was his name. And he started copying all of these teaching letters that we used to read at the end of practice. And there were volumes of them, by that time. So he started Xeroxing them, or whatever was the mode of copying at that time. And then when he went back to Poland, there were a few people that he knew there, guy Andrzej, and Ola Porter shortly after that. And anyway, so then they started a group there, and then they invited Seung Sahn to come. And at first it was not easy for him to get into Poland because Poland was still a communist country at that time, and South Korea had no diplomatic relationships with them.
Right.
They had relations with North Korea. But he got in somehow.
Yeah. It's interesting because that teaching really took off in Poland.
Yeah.
I mean...
Right. Well, I went to Poland in 1987.
Oh.
I think it was 87. Around the same time that I went to Korea for this thing. I don't know, it was in the same year or a year before. I had already gotten Inca by then.
Okay.
I got Inca in 1984. And the first time that I went to Poland was still under the communist regime, and it was tight there. And there were food lines lining up to grocery stores to get things, and blah, 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 So I think one of the reasons why Zen took off in Poland was they really understood a bad situation.
Yeah. That makes sense. So when you got Inca, was that yet another thing of like, oh, okay?
No.
So tell me about that.
That was different.
That definitely qualifies as taking on some responsibility, I think.
Yeah. And before that, I had been the head Dharma teacher in New York.
Okay.
Well, I'll back up slightly.
Sure.
In those days, after I became a Dharma teacher, they started having these Dharma teacher weekends at Providence Zen Center. And wasn't as organized as it is these days. Anyway, I went maybe once or twice. The last time I went, we had already bought the place in Cumberland, because we had that weekend up on the second floor. I don't think that Dharma room was built already, but it's on the second floor. And certainly the big one downstairs did not built. We're maybe practicing in what is referred to these days as the blue rug area.
Blue rug area, yes.
Anyway, we had some Dharma teachers, young men, and there were all these boring lectures about handing on Buddhism and mind. So I think I said to Ken Kessel, because he was living there, I'm not coming to these anymore. And so for quite a few years, I didn't show up there. So most people in New York, not in New York, most people like in Cambridge and Providence didn't know who I was at all. And so suddenly they hear this fat guy from New York is going to get Inca. So, who is he? But I had been, practicing with Zen since 1975, so it was like close to 10 years worth, and I had already been practicing before that. So, I had been gradually chipping away at various kongans, and so when I finished, the last one, he said, Inca is now possible. So this is a little interesting anecdote. So he said, but first, I think George and Bobby and Subong Sanim, he wasn't yet Subong Sanim,
right.
He was what was his name? Udum Sanim. And Link, they should all approve of him.
They should approve of them.
Approve of me.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I got a little energy up.
Were those, so
They
already all had Inca?
Yes.
Okay, so
yeah,
this was
yeah.
the first committee.
Yeah. First group was Bobby and George.
Yeah.
And then the second one was Link and Udumson.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Third one was Jacob and I.
Okay.
So at that time there were 4 of them. So he said that they should approve of it. So I said, Sanim, you're my teacher. Why do they need to approve of it? He said, calm down. he said, we're all one family here. This was where this notion of the committee started. Committee for like these days we make a formal committee whenever there's someone is put up for Inca. But this was at this point this was the kind of genesis of this thing. So he said we're all one family, so everybody should approve. Now, Bobby and George had been down here many times, and they knew me, and I had worked on kongans with them just as I had worked on Consignee, and Link also had been down here because Link at one point was the director of Quantum Zen School, and so he used to travel down here, especially during those years where we were having this building problem that I alluded to before. So the only one that I had never sat with was Udom Sanim, and he came shortly after that. So they all agreed that I was a good candidate. So, so in 1984, we had a ceremony at Providence Center. Jacob Pearl and I together got Inca.
At that point, was the distinction between Inca and full transmission already made, or was there?
Well, there was no one who had full transmission.
Okay, at that point, nobody had full transmission.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, I don't know whether something I ever talked about it at that point or not. I don't remember.
So when you received Inca, you could lead the retreats here?
Well, not immediately, because
After some training?
yeah, we had this procedure that you had to sit in the interview room with other teachers first for a number of months. So, but there was nothing like tightly specified.
Right.
So, but in any case, I got Inca in December, and because we were having Young Majinjin every month, someone was coming here, so I would sit in the interview room with them, and right after I got Inca, I went up to the Kyolche and sat the 7th-day Young Majinjin in the middle, and Mudungsani was leading it that year, so that was my first, training, and then Nick would come down here frequently, so I got training from him and from Bobby and George, etc. And I still was not let loose to go out on my own, but around July 4th, they were having a retreat in Seattle, and Mudungsani was supposed to go up there. He was the guiding teacher there, and he lived in Los Angeles at that time. And he was supposed to go up there to lead the retreat, but he was suspended from teaching shortly before that. And so they needed somebody to go out there and lead a retreat. So Seung Sahn was in New York maybe a couple of weeks before that, so he said to me, could you go to Seattle over 4th of July weekend? I said, well, let me talk to my wife. And so that was the first time they let me loose, because it was a matter of necessity. They needed somebody, no one else could do it.
And it went over just fine, I take it.
Fine.
Yeah. Good. So in this, it sounds like this is sort of the first committee, right? Like the beginnings of the committee.
Yeah.
The school sounds to me like was pretty solidly like about the Seung Sahn teachings, though. I mean, he had final say, and
well, that's what I was going to say.
Okay.
Even though there was, this committee, they all had approved, but still, he was the one who was essentially putting anyone forth, and if he didn't agree that somebody, should become a teacher, then that person was not going to. So it was a kind of benign dictatorship with some solicitation of what do you think and what do you think.
Interesting. Were there, you mentioned earlier the attempt to suspend morning practice, which didn't go over so well.
Yeah.
Were there other times when you or people tried to change things in the forms, which happened or didn't happen? Because some things changed over time.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't think of any real strong example, because essentially, for the most part, things are pretty much the same as when I first drove up.
Mm-hmm. There is
what are you thinking of when you say something?
I was thinking there are different kind of training structures now. There is such a thing as a senior Dharma teacher. There's such a thing as a Dharma teacher in training.
Yeah.
Which I guess
we already had senior Dharma teacher at that time, because I took the senior Dharma teacher precepts shortly before I got Inca.
Yeah.
I think I took the senior Dharma teacher precepts in the summer of that year, and then in the winter I got Inca. So we already had that, but I don't know whether, maybe by then also we had started this thing of 10 precepts, Dharma teacher in training. Maybe that came somewhat later.
What do you think that was about? I mean, it sounds like in the beginning it was much more about the Consignee determining if you were ready or not.
Right.
And
right, and some of his determination of ready or not had to do with need.
Ah.
You know, if a Zen center needed somebody who could be a Dharma teacher, and you were at least a what he considered a strong practicing person, he might say, you know, you should become a Dharma teacher now. And in a certain sense, we grew into those jobs because, you know, I mean, the way I made it sound in the beginning, you know, in terms of myself, you know, yeah, okay, you know, but I wasn't cavalier about it.
Right.
So if I was going to be a Dharma teacher, then I at least had to be practicing seriously and trying to know something about the Zen tradition and you know, a little about Buddhism in general. You know, so and we all, I would say, kind of grew into those roles because we had to, you know, and that we weren't bullshitting. So you know.
Yeah. Did you ever get into conflicts with the Consignee? Disagreements, fights?
I don't ever remember any real conflict when we got into it. Of course, he never pushed me. He always kind of respected that, you know, I was a lay person with 3 children at that time, and then I had a job, and you know that there was only so much that I could do and participate in, and he felt that I was, you know, participating sincerely. So he never pushed me in any way, you know. But other people sometimes he would push them in certain ways.
Did you ever live in the Zen Center?
Never.
Okay.
No, but I had that experience before. When I was a student of Swami Satchidananda's, myself and my wife and our oldest daughter, we all lived in the Integral Yoga Institute for close to 5 years. And that was a very similar situation, you know. Morning practice, people were living there, you know, get up, morning practice, and evening practice, and teach yoga classes, and you know, all that. And it was the same situation for me. Still, I was either going to school or had a job, or you know, whatever we were doing. So I understood what residential living in a quote-unquote spiritual community was like. So there was nothing foreign about residential Zen centers that I came in contact with.
Was your family involved in the practice, or are they involved?
In the Zen practice?
Yeah.
No. No, my wife had been involved with yoga practice, but again, I had been the one who was more involved with that and kind of pulled her along. And at the point where we moved out from there, she got less and less interested in practicing it. So, but she never stood in my way of, you know. So she met Sensei many times, but she never was interested in.
Yeah. So how did you get? How did the journey continue for you in terms of after Inca? Don't you have to do a lot of things before you become a Zen master?
Well, I wasn't thinking about that.
Aha.
And in fact,
It wasn't a career goal, I take it.
huh?
It was not a career goal of yours.
No, and I had this erroneous idea that, see, because maybe a few years after I got Inca, then Sun Sanin gave transmission to Bobby and George and Lung Sanin. That's when he became Subong Sanin. I don't remember what what year that was in, maybe 1990 or early 90s.
Yeah, it was at the 20th anniversary of the Providence Zen Center, I think.
Yes, it was.
When they built the pagoda.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what year that was, but that's, yeah.
Because we had this big celebration, and we had a huge tent in the back there, and that's where the ceremony went on. Yeah, probably somewhere.
That sounds right, 92 or something.
Yeah, that would have been 20 years.
Yeah.
So, Sahn had made those people go around and sit with other teachers, the same way as we still continue to do that. So, I was not particularly interested in doing any of that. And I was harboring this secret idea that because I was a lay person with a family and multiple responsibilities, that he wasn't going to make me do that, but he would give me transmissions someday anyway. So, but I wasn't kind of chafing after transmission, and then I was up at Providence Zen Center, I think for the summer weekend, sometime in the early 90s, and I found out that Jacob was going to start going around. So I said to him, well, if you're going to go around, I'll go around with you. So if it hadn't been for him deciding that he would go, I don't know that I would have ever decided to go, because I was actively teaching. I wasn't chafing after the title of Zen Master, and I didn't have impetus to go into it. And Seung Sahn never told me, you should go now, I guess he was just waiting to see what I was going to do. So Jacob and I went around together. We found out when Maizumi Roshi was having some situation where we could go and sit with him, the same with Sasaki Roshi and Eido Roshi, and etc.
So you would go and sit with them and do Kongan stuff with them?
Yeah.
Get a little stamp on your...
Well, they never gave us. They knew what we were there for, but they weren't giving stamp of approval. The procedure was that we were supposed to sit with them for however many days we said, have interviews, and at some point, based on something that they would say, we were supposed to kind of grab hold of that and engage them in Dharma combat. And then when we came back from that experience, we were supposed to write that up, what had happened, and send it to Seung Sahn. And if you wanted to discuss it with us, or so that was the procedure at that time.
Interesting.
That's still pretty much is the procedure, except that now there's a committee instead of just him.
Right. Was it a good experience to go around and sit with these other folks?
Yeah, very good experience.
And you did it together with Jacob the entire time?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I did go after, all we had to do was sit with 3. But after we did the 3, I had some desire to go and sit with Aiken Roshi in Hawaii, so I did go and do that on my own. I didn't have to.
So you got transmission at the same time with Jacob.
Yeah.
So did you feel like you had sort of your Dharma paths were sort of together, or did you have a lot to do with each other?
No, not a lot
really.
to do with each other.
Right, you were both Wus, now that I think of it. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Okay, I didn't make that connection before. Yeah.
Jacob at certain times lived part-time in the Zen Center in New York because of some business things he had going on here. So I would see him sometimes. But no, we didn't have like a real close, chummy relationship. But we shared those two major experiences.
Sure, yeah. So how did life change when you became a Zen master?
I don't know that it did.
I didn't?
I don't think so.
Okay. You had to be willing to be involved with this organization,
Well,
right? And you are, and
Yeah.
have been throughout this time, right?
Yeah.
So the quantum school now exists without Zen Master Seung Sahn being alive. So how do you think has changed? Has it changed? I mean, how do you do this? How have you been collectively doing the Zen school when the founding teacher isn't there?
Yeah, it has changed, I would say, because initially there was a school council that was supposedly the governing body of the school, and the school council did not consist of all the Jito Popsonis and Zen masters. School council consisted of representatives from all the different Zen centers.
Oh, okay.
That would come together maybe 3 times a year.
And they may or may not be teachers?
Right.
Ah.
Right. But they had to be involved for considerable length of time. There was someone like you could have been on the school council. Anyway, at some point that was not working for various reasons. I don't. It wasn't efficient and effective, and we even brought in an organizational consultant at one time. And at a certain point, we disbanded that school council, and the teachers became the board of directors, so to speak, of the quantum school. I think I had been on the school council, at least towards the latter stages of it, because I remember being in that meeting where we had the consultant come in for a week. So, in any case, I've been involved in the governance of the school since that time up to now. So,
was it something that was initiated by the council or by the Sansanim to get like a consultant or to change the structure? Was he very involved in that, or was that more you guys doing?
That was probably the council suggested, ran it by him. One other thing I should say, going back to the Inca time. Besides this, be challenging, and why did these other people have to approve of me? As I told you before, I had stopped going to all these Dharma teacher young Junctions and even to the 3 times a year ceremonies. Never showed up for these. So he said to me, when he was telling me that I could get into, he said that sometimes though it's necessary for you to come to Providence. He said, otherwise no one knows who you are. And so I said, okay. So that was when I started participating more.
Makes a certain amount of sense.
Yes, right. I understood the wisdom of it. I was just kind of hiding out and avoiding the whole. But I couldn't hide out in the local Zen Center because anyway. And when I first went to the Kyolche up there, right after I got Inca to get trained by Consignee, they had a Dharma talk 2 times a week during so I was assigned to answer questions after and one woman who was living in Providence at that time was sitting in the wheelchair. She raised her hand. Could you tell us who you are? Because I don't know. I don't know who you are. So that was the kind of.
Somebody didn't do a good introduction, clearly. Well, that's interesting. So then you started going more.
Yeah.
And yeah, interesting. So what kind of other things changed? You said there were changes in the Zen school. The governing. So
I would say that the big change, not in terms of the daily practice or retreat practice or any of that kind of stuff, but the big change in terms of decision making on a school level, and that in some cases might affect the local Zen centers, is that these days there is no one person who is going to have the final say. And there was some debate about that even in terms of the Teachers' Compact and the bylaws and all that, because the way it read when it was set up, when Seung Sahn was still alive, was that the school Zen master could have veto power over it. That was written down, and people wanted that out. So no one, not even Bobby, has like final veto power over anything. So that's one of the things that has changed. So it's become much more of a consensus kind of situation. And the only thing that we've done in recent years, but again, it's not like we made this committee of the American school Zen Master, which is me these days, and the European one and the Asian one, and Bobby. We have Skype meetings maybe once a quarter or once every 2-3 months, and supposedly we can, to some degree, set the direction of certain things, but still it's not on the level of where this is the way it is, this is what we're going to do. So that has changed considerably. The other thing that's different, but this was different all along, and this relates actually to Seung Sahn style as compared, let's say, with some of the Japanese teachers who came here. We have always had, at least since this quantum Zen school thing arose, and it was there even before that, but more loosely stated, we've always had this kind of unified teaching vision and style, and everybody who is made a teacher signs the Teachers' Compact, which says that we will, like teaching within the quantum Zen school, adhere to the forms and the teaching style of the quantum school of Zen. Whereas they don't have that kind of unity of what to call it exactly. Like if you look at Maizumi Roshi's lineage, there are a lot of teachers in that lineage, probably as many as we have, if not more. But they are pretty much autonomous. They are not a unified school. I'm not saying one is better than the other, I'm just making a distinction. So they each have their own Zen centers and their own teaching style, and make their own decisions about things, and the way Bernie Glassman is teaching and who his successors are is very different, let's say, than the way Daigo Lori was teaching, and who's taken over from him, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and one of the things in conjunction with that in terms of us is that we came up with an ethics statement at one point and an ethics committee, so that if there were some teacher who was in some way violating the spirit of being a teacher, or using their position in a way that was not kosher, that we had a way of handling that as a school, and we have suspended people at times. Some of them never came back, some of them did come back, but those other groups don't have a unified ethics, both ethics statement and ethics committee that could vote on that, and
Is that a unique thing to the quantum school, you think, in North America?
So. I think so. Because Judy Reutman, who goes to the American Zen teachers meetings quite frequently, she said that people there have commented on that in terms of something that we have that they don't have. And I think that comes from Seung Sah's vision of having a school, and even an international school.
So, I mean, you said it's not better or worse off, the different ways of organizing this. But I mean, what are some, you think, advantages to having this school? I mean, this unified ethics procedure is one, but I assume there are also some drawbacks to it, of course, right? Everything has pluses and minuses, I assume. What are some advantages of having the school for teachers?
Well, one is that no matter where you go to teach, you're pretty sure that they're going to know the same forms, and that you're not going to have to reinvent the wheel each time. So that, I think, is beneficial just in two ways. That if you go to lead a retreat somewhere, from a teacher's point of view, you can more or less count on familiarity with procedures and the form of the retreat, and not that, I mean, there are glitches here and there in some places, that are not, there are some people that are very up on the form and some people that are not so. But in any case, that's one event. The other is that I think no matter where you go, even just in terms of daily practice, there's a certain continuity of style from one place to the next, and even from the United States to Europe to Asia to a considerable degree. So in that sense, if somebody is a quantum school Zen student, no matter where they go, they can feel reasonably at home in terms of practice.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually done that when the Paris Center was still there. I was in Paris for a conference, and I just went by. They didn't know who I was, but I knew all the chants.
Right.
It was nice. It had that sort of familiar feeling.
Right.
Yeah.
The only thing you didn't know was the Heart Sutra in French.
That's right. That's when I needed the book. Zen teaching, or traditionally the whole mind-to-mind transmission and being independent and being able to make your own school and things like that. It sounds to me like there is a sort. I don't know if this is true, but maybe people can see it as a curtailing of their individual style, or at least I think that some people have left the school because they felt that they wanted to make their own thing.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Is it a curtailing, or I mean, it's self-imposed, obviously.
I don't feel it as a curtailing, because I never had any desire to do anything.
Anything other?
But some people obviously did. And Seung Sahn used to say, if you're a Zen master and you want to go and do something else, go ahead and do that. But when you teach in a quantum Zen school center, at that time, then you should follow the forms of our teaching style.
So I can see the advantages of it being the uniformity and the kind of familiarity for organizational matters and also for the practice.
I mean, it's interesting. We have a training program here for Gestalt therapists as a faculty. I would say the same statement goes on here that I think you could say in the Quantum School of Zen. Many times students here will say, because they get exposed to many different people on the faculty, and part of the training here is to observe demonstrations that the faculty will, will work with somebody who's a student and do a therapy session with an audience, workshops kind of style, and then there'll be some discussion of what went on in the work afterwards as a, a didactic kind of. Anyway, the students will often say, you all are Gestalt therapists, we can see that. You all pretty much adhere to the same theory, but your individual styles or ways of working are considerably different, probably based on personality, inclination, blah, blah, blah. And I think you could say the same thing about different teachers in the Quantum Zen School, even though we're all basically, following the same things. Different people might emphasize a certain thing, especially if you listen to people give a Dharma talk or answer questions or something like that. There'll be a different emphasis based on what was probably most meaningful in their own practice, and then their ability to connect with particular students in relationship to what the students need, and the way that they'll do it. So some people might have a more in-your-face style of doing things, and some people might have a more, kind of become like water style.
Yeah. What is it that is the core of the teachings that you agree to keep? Can you describe it? I mean, I think I probably know it and recognize it because I know that Zen Master Seung Sahn's teachings, but if you had to describe it to somebody outside of the school, like what is it that is the core of these teachings?
I think the core of the teaching is that we are attempting in many ways to see through our coloration, mental coloration, emotional coloration, and return to our innate clarity and manifest that in various circumstances and situations according to time, place, and the relationship of the moment. So to me, the core of the teaching and the core of the practice, even in terms of meditation and action, is a kind of non-clinging, non-attachment, but not detachment. And so from that, especially on the level of relationship and responsibility, is where compassion and connection and recognition of that arises.
Does some of the form of your first experience in interviews, the hitting, right, or the I'm going to call them slogans. I mean,
Yeah.
Zen Master Seung Sahn sort of teaching phrases that are repeated often in the same intonation that he would say them. The only go straight, don't know. They're shorthand for something, of course.
Yeah.
But are they part of what is at the core? Because interestingly, what you just described didn't use any of those terms.
Right, yeah.
So
No, I don't think those things are at the core. Those things are skillful means of communicating something.
so you could teach without them, with different.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a vocabulary. Even this is part of a vocabulary. Or it communicates something.
When there, and you've been involved with the school for a long time, when there have.
I just want to say,
okay.
Going back to like repeating those phrases in the same intonation, there was a certain, at least this is the way I see it, like, there is a certain kind of loving, tongue-in-cheek kind of, I wouldn't say making fun of, but because Sansaneem's use of the English language was so original in a certain way, when many times when we would kind of imitate him, I think there were two things that went on. Sometimes people would kind of try to clone him, which probably was not so effective after a while. But there was also a certain kind of inside joke with it, so sometimes when some of us that spent time with him or knew him will say those things to each other. There's this kind of almouse poking fun at the way he would use them, but there's an endearment about it as well. So sometimes people will use those kind of phrases in that kind of way rather than it just being a slogan.
Well, that's interesting because I think that works out really differently among people who knew him.
Yeah.
And when that has to be translated across sort of a generational almost divide now. So how is that? I mean, because teachers still do this, right? I mean, you will still, of course, hear people use these kind of loving, maybe lovingly mocking phrases. How does that change now that we have generations of teachers coming up who never knew him?
I think, certainly that part of it wouldn't be there. But also, I think, like, for example, before I told the first time I ever heard him use this phrase, try.
Yeah.
But that had a meaning to me, especially when he said it at that time. And so if I use that phrase with students, I'm going to give a little background about, maybe I'm going to talk about sincerity of effort, or I might tell that story, but I'm going to emphasize that a phrase like "just try" that you find in Quantum Zen School teachings really has to do with sincerity of effort and finding meaningfulness in what you're doing, and also having a spirit of adventure to just try something. He used to say, yeah, we tried that. Why not? So that's an imitation of him.
Why not?
Right. But there's a certain spirit in that. Why not? Because I remember reading a book on existential psychotherapy, probably years before I met Consignee, or around that. Anyway, this analyst was saying that he had been trained as a classical analyst first. He said in classical psychoanalysis, the question most often is why. But in existentially oriented therapy, the question more often is, why not? As a kind of challenge. You know. So when he would say that, yeah, we tried that, why not? You know, or had a certain kind of prodding, and also making it take a look at, yeah, what are you holding on to? Why not try that? You know. But you're right that some of those slogans would also be used as weapons and bludgeons, and that's if they become. But then they become almost like fundamentalized. So it behooves all of us to be careful with that kind of stuff.
It's interesting, I think, to see if this teaching, which is in some ways very, it's Korean Zen teachings translated into American context, if it becomes more American and more European and more Asian as sort of time goes on. Do you think there is a sort of change now, 10 years after his death? I mean, Europe, the US, or the Americas and Asia?
I think that the change would be in the, for one change would be in the vocabulary. That Seung Sahn would never use a phrase like sincere effort, or he certainly wouldn't talk about an existential challenge. Like why not? That's my background, so
Sure.
I can feel free to use that because I see the conjunction of those two. So I think based on whoever is doing the teaching as time goes on, the vocabulary will broaden without it getting watered down. That's the important consideration. And some of the forms even have changed a little bit. Like I remember being in a teachers' meeting a number of years ago, and Mark Houghton said that the people at Cambridge Zen Center were, maybe complaining is not the right word, but I can't find a different word.
Raising an issue.
Yes, so that's good. Raising an issue about how long the chanting was in the morning and the fact that they had to go to work. And so he didn't want to just go ahead and change something on his own. So he brought this up in our teachers' meeting, and people said to him, Mark, you're the guy who teaches that something. If you want to change something like that, then you should go ahead and change it. And I think that's when they cut back doing as much chanting in the morning. I think they want to do the morning bell chant, or I don't know exactly what they're doing. And recently we did the same thing in New York. So some things like that have changed. Also in Korea, they have changed things. Not that they changed themselves, they went back to using the Korean, to give a couple of examples. But that is because culturally they wanted it to appear, not so alien within Korea. So, for example, in a Korean temple, the 1,000 Hands and Eyes Sutra is chanted in the morning, early morning. One monk walks around the temple compound with a moktak and chants the 1,000 Hands and Eyes Sutra. And then they gradually get up and come into the chanting hall. They don't all chant the bell chant together like we do, the morning bell chant. One monk chants the morning bell chant, the rest of them just sit there and listen to it. So they went back to, and I think that morning bell chant is going on as people come into the chanting hall, because what the Sangha is going to participate in is chanting the homage to the three jewels and chanting the Heart Sutra and whatever else they might do in that particular temple. So they went back to doing it that way.
Is that the Chogye, what Chogye was doing the entire time?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's like the quantum form going back to the...
Yeah. Because I remember the first time I went to Korea in '87, we got into Seoul quite late at night and I went to sleep. But a monk came around and he was chanting Thousand Hands of Medicine, and I was like so excited to be in Korea. I got up, even after probably half jet lagged, and, I got up and went to the Dharma Hall, and Consignee was there and some other monks who were living in the temple were there, and he started to do the morning bell chant, and I started to chant with, but I could see no one else was chanting this. So that that was I saw that that's the traditional style. So they went back to doing it that way at Musangsa because they wanted to not look so different. And I think they are also, even though they have men and women practicing together during the Kyolche, they sit on separate sides of the hall, I've been told. I've never been there during that. And I think they even enter through separate doors or something.
As a it's just a cultural difference.
Yeah. And if you go to the Zen Center in Hong Kong or in Singapore, they're probably doing certain Chinese things as well as what we do.
Why are there so few monks in America?
Yeah, well, I think because one, we don't have a format to support them. So at times there have been more than there are now, but mostly they were living at Providence Zen Center when Consignee was there, because he was a senior monk who could, lend some guidance there. But it's hard to, first of all, it's hard to be a monk in the United States and our Zen centers because you're the only one who's a monk in most instances. And so you never get the experience of living in a monastic community. That's one part that, and that would be important, I think, to somebody who is interested in the monk's lifestyle, of living with other monks who have like-minded kind of orientation to being a monk as a calling or vocation.
A lot of nuns or monks that come back after training drop out of monastic community after a fairly short time for that reason, probably, right? Yeah.
The other thing is that we don't have a financial setup to support them either. So if they were living in a Zen center, that particular Zen center would have to support them, and many Zen centers don't have the ability to do that.
So probably, because of that, there's not going to be a big monastic community here. It's going to be supported by lay practice continuously.
Unless something changes,
In the quantum school, when there have been conflicts or struggles, growing pains, whatever, how would you characterize them? What have they been about? I mean, I know there have been some times when some teacher left for some reason or another, but are there other sort of edgy situations, struggles? What are the struggles of the school?
Well, there have been some minor struggles, I would say, in recent years about certain things about formal practice, like that kind of stuff, and it seemed like I mean, and some of these things are like so trivial in a way that it becomes tedious to keep talking about them. And but for example, the way Seung Sahn taught us to do a standing bow was to stand up and drop your hands, down to here.
Mm-hmm.
Now in Korea these days they don't do that. They keep their hands here and they bow like this.
Mm-hmm.
So at Musansa they went back to this style, and it was claimed that the Koreans, whoever they might be, who saw us doing this other kind of bowing and dropping the hands, thought that this looked silly. So they went back to using this same form that the rest of the Koreans use. Then, when people went from Europe and spent some time at Musansa, they saw that they were bowing that way. And they went back to Europe. And so then there was this big discussion about, well, they're bowing this way in Korea, should we bow this way or not? So there became this big discussion about which way to bow. Now, of course, this is like, from a certain point, who cares? But there was this big discussion back and forth. And then Bobby put forth this idea, well, why don't we all bow the way they're doing it, it's a small thing, and maybe for school unity, we'll all do it the same way. Okay? Well, some people were readily willing to go along with that. Other people said, Seung Sahn taught us this other way. I'm comfortable with that. Why we got to change to something? So there was some, a little clashing around. This is just one example.
But it's a good example,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Because in some ways, it's completely ridiculous.
Yes.
Because it's really not a central aspect of
Right.
enlightenment, I would
Right.
attending it.
That's what I'm using.
But it becomes an example of the uniformity of practice, and
Right.
that people get really sort of, why is it important? It's interesting.
Yeah, and the only reason I went along with it, because I didn't consider it important, or I felt like if they want to do that in Korea, they need to do that. That's their business. And I understand the cultural reason for wanting to go along with what's already there, but that doesn't mean that we in the United States or in Europe necessarily need to go along with it. But the only reason I went along with it was because Bobby said, why don't we just try this? So, okay. But I find myself sometimes, like, for example, there are some times when I won't do all 108 prostrations anymore if my knees are giving me trouble. I've got arthritis in both knees at this point. So some days they cooperate with me reasonably well, and some days they don't. Anyway, so I've developed this thing of like doing maybe 6 or 7 full prostrations and 6 or 7 standing bows. And when I do the standing bows, I just kind of automatically do this way that I originally learned. So, but I mean, in the Zen Center here in New York, there's only 2 or 3 of us usually practicing in the morning. So it's but if I was with a big group in a public situation, I probably would make sure that I was doing it the way that.
Called a together action,
Right.
or otherwise known as peer pressure,
Right.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
And in fact, one time, several years ago, I was at Kwang-Richard Center, and I think maybe Bobby wasn't there for this ceremony, So I was handed the Mokta to do the Consignee Bosalche. So later, after the ceremony was over and we were in our room, Chommusanin came in, dark. So he said to me, he said, "You're a Zen master. You can do whatever you want, obviously. But," he said, "you actually are holding the Moktak not in the right way." So, yeah. I always, from the very beginning, held the thing on the bottom of the handle, like that, and hit the Moktak. And he said, "No, actually the correct way to hold it is to hold it up here, where the handle meets the ball of the Moktak." He said, "If you hold it there, it's actually a little easier than the way you hold it. And you can also kind of put your hand against your chest there if it's getting tired." So he said, "But you can do whatever you want." So I said, "Well, if this is the right way, I'll do it that." So, but I had never, I don't know why I had never noticed this before, probably because I just started doing it that way, 20 years ago, and never paid any attention to how anyone was holding the Moktak.
And nobody else came and told you either,
Exactly.
apparently.
He had the chutzpah, saying Yiddish, to come, but he did say, he said, "You're a Zen master and you can do what you want."
I can see how minor.
But he said to me, "But if students are, and this is why I paid attention to him, he said, if students are watching you, which they probably are, they won't learn, how to hold the thing as a proper way." So since then I've held them up like that.
I think that's the best reason I have to tell people why should we follow the forms, to not confuse other people.
Right.
Those seem really minor issues that can become big, and people can get all kinds of involvements of cultural egos and whatnot.
But now here's another one. See, I think as time goes on, things proliferate or differentiate. So there certainly is, at this point in time, different teachers using the konans in slightly different ways. Looking for a different kind of response to certain konans, not to all of them.
Technically, there should be uniformity in it, right?
More or less.
Or originally, that was the intention. Okay.
Well, Satsuma had his things that he was looking for in terms of answers to at least to certain kinds of konans. He once told me when he was training, certain konans, you can leave a lot of space and any kind of answer is okay. But certain other konans, should be a certain kind of more specific kind of. And even for newer students, this kind of answer would be okay. For older students, that kind of answer is not so acceptable anymore. But anyway, so there are some differences around certain konans that different teachers have, and even more so between some of the teachers in Europe and some of the teachers in the United States. But what we've begun to do in the United States anyway is, as part of our teachers' meetings sometimes, have some discussion so that at least we know, okay, if we can't all agree, but can we all agree that this is, if we can't all agree, no, I don't see it that way, then at least I know this is the way Jane teaches this, or this is the way Mark teaches this. Okay, so if someone would come to me and present that kind of answer, I'm not going to say that's wrong, because I already know someone else is using it, and I can understand why they're using it in this slightly different way. I mean, it's not like, you know, apples and pork chops or something like that. But what I might say is, yeah, I know that, you know, someone else in your past that was on, I use that a little differently. So while you're here with me, if we're going to work on that konan, then I'm looking for something a little different. So you have to get in alignment with me while you're sitting with, you know. Or I'll just say, you know, if the person, you know, has a guiding teacher, and you know, you work on that with them, and we'll work on something else. So so that's kind of interesting. Though, see, even in one generation from the source, different people have different ideas.
And these are all people who
Yes,
sat with
that's what I'm
Consignee,
saying.
right?
Yeah. So different people have different ideas about what particular konans, either what the answer is, or what the point of that konan is, or why they're having this particular answer, because they view the thing as a little different than someone else's viewing. And so, in any case, as long as we're clear on those distinctions, then you don't need to make it totally the same. Okay? I can see why you're doing that. I'm not in, I see it differently. I'm not in agreement with that, but I'm not saying you're wrong.
So that's a way of dealing with sort of personal differences of expression, attainment, whatever, and while the intention is to keep it uniform.
Right. Right, and I mean, again, like just with the bowing thing, none of these things are as vitally important as cultivating compassion, cultivating clarity, you know, being useful in the world. If you have less baggage, those are training devices, and also to a certain extent you could say that konans that we use to a certain extent could be teaching different aspects of Buddhist teaching of mind in a non-conceptual or not so conceptual way. You know, that's why, you know, if you look at Sun Salim's scheme of the four like this is, you know, they're talking about different aspects of the way people perceive things, or you know, so you know, all that has to do with, there's a background of Buddhist teaching about that kind of stuff,
which we never really explain, which is interesting, right? I mean, one of the things that I've heard Paul Park, for example, when I talked to him, say people who have heard Zen Sanim give Dharma talks in Korean, is that he in some ways was more scholarly because he had a lot more facility with the language in some of those contexts. It seems to me that in our school, in our teachings, there is very often very little explanation. I mean, I think you probably do more of it, and you've written about books about it and things like that. But we tend to not do a lot of explaining, right? Would you say that's true? I mean, in general, that there's not a lot of explaining, there's more sort of...
Well, I think, again, you can find different teachers that have different desires or needs to explain things or to give a context to things, you know. So I think some of that has to do with degree of interest.
On the part of the teacher?
Yeah. Also, though, I don't know if I totally agree with Paul, although Paul certainly understands Korean, but I have seen like a few videos of Seung Sahn giving a talk in Korean with subtitles, and it wasn't much different than what he usually, says. I don't know. I have to look at who was the audience that he was talking to. Like if he was talking to university students, maybe that they brought him there because they wanted, a talk on Zen and so, or some introduction to Zen that was going to include meditation practice or something like that. He probably talked pretty much in the same way that he would talk to us if you translated it. Whereas if he was talking to some other people, it might be different.
Yeah, it's his talks when I've seen recordings or heard recordings or even reading it, they seem always to me a lot more, and you mentioned it earlier, a lot more grounded and not particularly intellectual. And I think it's true that he did study and he learned and he knew all the sutras and things like that through his training, but he didn't place, we don't do a lot of sutra study at our school, right? Actually, we don't do any. So there's just not a lot of emphasis placed on that as practice, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, if someone wants to familiarize himself with some sutra or some parts of some sutras, and I wouldn't discourage that. And, he didn't discourage that. But some people he tried to encourage them to do it, and they weren't interested. Because I remember he had this idea with Link Rhodes. Link Rhodes has a PhD in what, physics or something, very bright guy. So he tried to coerce Link into studying some sutras, and Link just was not interested in that stuff at all,
Yeah, it seems that it's not something that appears a lot, or maybe it's just the teachers I've sat with a lot in the teachings. It's something a lot of students that come new to a Zen center will, that's often how people end up coming to a Zen center, that they've read something. And so then they want to talk about what they read. And it's like, no, we don't do that here.
Right. Well, but of course, that's there in the Zen tradition, long ways back even, you see like dialogues between old Zen masters, discouraging some student from, don't read anything.
Right.
But I mean, that you don't find that across the board with old Zen teachers, because some of them would quote stuff, but
it might be skillful means. If somebody who has read way too much comes along, it might be the right advice to tell them to stop reading.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Or if someone thinks that that's the way they're going to, uncover something.
Yeah. Do you have any other stories you want to tell about the Seung Sahn, or?
Let's see. One is coming to me. I think this was the first time we went to Korea.
You went with him to Korea?
Yeah, I think this was the Single Flower Conference, and I guess it was '87. Anyway, we were on this bus tour, and he was with us at this particular time. In times after that, he never went on the bus tour. But we got to see various places and got let into various places that we would not have been let into.
Because he was with you at the time.
Yeah. So, for example, there's one of the major temples in Korea is a temple called Bulguksa. We didn't go to that temple this last time. But up above Bulguksa, on the mountain, higher up, there's a cave. And in the cave, there is a Buddha. It's called the Sokoran Buddha. It's a very famous Asian statue of Buddha. It's a, I think the head of it is the cover on the big compass of Zen.
Oh, okay.
I think that's the head of
Okay.
the Sokoran Buddha. Anyway, it's in this grotto, the cave, and the whole cave has been carved into, because surrounding this main Buddha figure are many bodhisattvas and different things. Anyway, because this is one of the seven wonders of the world, they have put a glass door on the front of the cave, and if you're a tourist going there to see it, all you can do is walk in front of the glass door and look and see it. But the time that Consignee went with us, they unlocked the glass door, slid it back, and we went inside, and really saw the details of all these things. Anyway, that particular trip, two kind of humorous things. When we went to what is this big temple? Big temple that has the wood blocks of the Tripitaka Hansa.
Yeah.
Anyway, we went to this temple, and besides, they did the same thing with the two halls that hold these wood blocks. They let us go inside, they never let anyone else. But there was a monk who came to meet us there and show us around the temple. And one of his hands, all he had was a stump there, and his thumb. And the story is that shortly after the Second World War, this monk wanted that belief in Buddhism in Korea was way down. He wanted to revive the spirit of faith in Buddhist practice. So he wrapped his hand in waxed something, or a string or gauze or something. And in front of the assembly, as they were all chanting, I don't know if they were chanting Kwan Mosa or he lit his hand on fire and burnt his hand off, except for this stump that's left there and the thumb. And I guess he went into some kind of trance, so to not feel the intensity of the pain. Your hand burning off, you'd probably be screaming like anything. Anyway, so this guy came out and showed us around the temple and blah, 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 blah. And he was also considered a master calligrapher, and he made his calligraphies with just this stump and the thumb, because you don't control the brush. But anyway, when we came back to Seoul at the end of the trip, after morning practice, Consignee was answering some questions. And it was Kwang-Richard, who at that time was not Kwang-Richard, he was Joe Diggs from Roxbury. We were practicing at the Cambridge Zen Center in Providence. Anyway, he said, Consignee, that monk that we met at Hansa who burnt his fingers off, is he enlightened? And Consignee said back, Yeah, he attained burnt finger enlightenment. Somewhere else on that trip, the bus came to the end of a long dirt road, and we got off the bus because we were staying at different temples each night. So we're in this open field, and there's like a big cliff in front of us. Where's the temple?
Up on the cliff?
Yeah. And we see this thing that looks like a wheelbarrow and a cable going up there. What is that? We're not going to ride in that thing, are we? No, that's for the bags. So we all put our bags in this thing, put them in a pile here. And then we're pointed, the path is over there. So the thing I left out was, this was the middle of August.
Ooh.
And it's really humid in Korea in the middle of August, even worse than this.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe worse than Florida here. And part of the joke of this trip was, whenever we would get near a temple, we were told that the men should put on neckties and a jacket, and the women should have something that looked appropriate, like a skirt or anyway. So the joke on the bus was, "It's now time to put on your beautiful clothes," because that was Consignee's phrase, everyone should wear their beautiful.
The point being that you needed to look respectful, is
Exactly.
that it? I see.
Exactly.
I see.
This was before Koreans were walking around with shorts on and all that stuff, At that time, if you were a grown man, you were walking around with shorts on, that was considered low class. Now, probably,
Right.
Anyway, so we get out of the bus, and we got our neckties and blue blazers or whatever we got on, and the path is over there. So we started walking, sweating like hell.
Yeah.
Finally, we get to the top, and Seung Sahn is standing right there at the top, to the entrance to the temple compound. So, and he looks at me, and he's sweating, and he says, "Hard training, huh?"
He enjoyed that.
So, yeah, that was all he had to say to him. Hard training. Yeah, he said it with a big laugh.
He was prone to making jokes, no? I
Yeah,
mean, he
yeah.
was a very funny kind of guy.
Yeah,
So yeah, that's very interesting. The way down must have been easier.
I think so.
Maybe you could take the jacket off at that point.
Yeah, although sometimes, going down is harder than going up.
Yeah,
Although
yeah.
in those days I didn't have the problems with my knees that I have now.
Are there questions I should have asked that I didn't ask you? Or other things you want to say?
Nothing that I can think of. I don't know. Pause for a minute and see if there's anything else that I want to say.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time and all your stories and wisdom.